think that the best way to encapsulate the book of Romans in a very short, brief statement is that saved people need to be saved. Let me break that statement down. The book of Romans was written to born-again believers. It wasn't written to tell people how to be saved. It was written to people who already have been saved. When I went to seminary, I was taught that the book of Romans was or is Paul's great treatise on the doctrine of salvation or eternal life. And you've probably heard that too. If you've sat through any sermons or read any commentaries, it's very common to hear that the book of Romans is Paul's great treatise on the doctrine of salvation. You'll hear that over and over again. But Paul was writing to born-again believers. And so that should cause us to question the idea that the book of Romans is about how to have eternal life. The book of Romans was written to saved people, people who have eternal life. But again, I think that the book of Romans is encapsulated by the statement, saved people need to be saved. Well, if they've already been saved, what do they need to be saved from? Well, saved people need to be saved because Paul says in chapter 1, verse 18, that the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and righteousness of men who suppress the truth by unrighteousness. And in this verse, we see that the wrath of God is being revealed. So this is a present tense verb, which indicates that this is not talking about God's future wrath in a future eschatological judgment of sin. It's talking about God's present wrath against present sin. And in Romans chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2, verses 1 through 5, we see that God's wrath against sin is universal. God's temporal wrath against sin is universal. We know that God's wrath is temporal, not eschatological, because this is present tense wrath that is being revealed from heaven against all ungodliness. We know that God's temporal wrath against sin is not only temporal, but it's also universal. God's wrath is being revealed against all ungodliness. And it's often been said that the word all means all, and that's all that all means. And so all ungodliness refers to all ungodliness, whether it be the ungodliness of believers or the ungodliness of unbelievers or believers. Now, through the rest of Romans chapter 1, Paul talks about God's wrath being revealed against immoral people. And there is a long laundry list of immorality that Paul talks about at the end of Romans chapter 1. If you've read Romans chapter 1 or studied it or heard sermons on it, you know that that list is pretty inclusive and it's pretty decisive. But God's wrath is not just being revealed against the ungodliness of immoral people. When you get to the first 5 verses of Romans chapter 2, you see that God's temporal wrath is also being revealed against the moral person, against the religious person, be they born again or not. And so what we see in Romans 1 and the beginning of chapter 2 is that God's temporal wrath against sin is universal. It is directed against the sin of both believers and unbelievers. Unbelievers and believers. So believers can experience God's temporal wrath against sin. And we also know that from the last verse in chapter 1, where Paul is summarizing the laundry list of sins against the immoral person. And he says that although they, the immoral people, know the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but also give hearty approval to those who practice them. And so the temporal wrath, we know that God's wrath here is temporal because it's talking about death, the consequences of that sin being death. And Paul's talking about physical death here. So Romans chapter 1, verse 32 is actually another verse that we can put into the bucket of sin unto death. That goes along with 1 John 5:16 and James 5:19 and 20 as well. So God's wrath against sin is temporal. It is physical. The penalty for sin includes up to and including death, physical death. So God's wrath against sin is temporal, it's physical, and it's universal.